Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online for this virtual session as part of Nova Scotia Human Rights Week. My name is Jeff Overmars. I'm a communications advisor at the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, and it's my pleasure in a moment to introduce our presenters. But first, I would like to acknowledge that we are attending this virtual session in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation. Mi'kmaq people have made this land their home since time immemorial. They are the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, and our relationships in Mi'kma'ki are governed under the treaties of peace and friendship. The Human Rights Commission acknowledges and values such teachings as Emsit Nogama, meaning all my relations, which values the inherent dignity and interconnectivity of all beings. It's our hope that through sessions such as this, we can advance understanding and dignity for all Nova Scotians and welcome you here to this space virtually. I do want to also acknowledge the deep contributions of persons of African descent to the pursuit of greater equity and inclusion across Nova Scotia, not only within their communities, but within communities of all persons in Nova Scotia. It is the foundational work of African Nova Scotians that led to the establishment of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission many years ago and the drafting of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. So the work that we do is building upon their legacies and hopefully honoring the great work that they've done. And it's important that we continue to recognize the foundational work that those that came before us have done and allowed us to continue to do. I do want to again welcome you all. This is the 14th session that we've been hosting during Nova Scotia Human Rights Week, and we've been just thrilled with the participation and also just the breadth of subjects that have been covered over the past number of days, and really appreciate the folks from the Youth Project joining us today to share and speak about anti-trans rhetoric and policies across Canada and regionally. It's an incredibly timely and important subject, and really hope that you enjoy the session today. I want to thank Carmel Farahbakhsh, the Executive Director of the Youth Project, and Chris Cochrane, um, Support Services and Education with the Youth Project, for being here today. I'll pin you just a moment, Chris, once we get started, but I will just remind folks that today's session, the chat is not enabled, nor are your cameras or microphones. So the means of engagement throughout is the Q&A box, which you can find down at the bottom of your screen. If at any point today you have any questions that come to mind, please do drop them into the Q&A. Carmel and Chris will attend to those questions at the appropriate time during the presentation. So if your question's not answered immediately, don't dismay. We will get to that point. Also, ASL is available on the call for anybody wishing to spotlight our interpreter, Monica, here today. As well, captions are enabled, and you can turn closed captioning on at any point by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. And without further ado, over to you, Carmel.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. With our time today, I'm going to speak a little bit about anti-trans rhetoric in relationship to policy and legislative change, and talk a little bit about the local landscape that we're working with. And then Chris is going to be talking about access to healthcare. So I will start by sharing my screen. Great. Wonderful. So I'll be talking about, again, policies across the country. First, I just want to introduce the Youth Project. We are a provincial organization. Um, we've been working together as an organization since '93 to create supportive spaces for 2S LGBTQIA plus youth through contexts of education, resource expansion, and community development, all under the umbrella of support and the myriad ways that we do so through things such as our summer camp programs to core programming that we offer month to month and GSA support across the province. And I think something that will be continuous throughout this presentation is the deep importance of representation for trans youth and trans children to have throughout not only the province, but their country, especially as we're navigating a huge wave of anti-trans legislation nationally. So thinking about our local landscape and local to us LGBTQIA plus communities, there are a lot of issues that affect our community as much as well as many other communities across the province. So the realities of our community are not only unique to us, but specifically, I think are intersecting with a huge amount of need throughout the province. So we see things like housing and food security, access to stable housing, representative to spaces of learning, education and early childhood development, aware and supportive mental health resources that are culturally relevant, culturally competent, and also trans competent, um, access to gender affirming healthcare, um, a bunch of different social issues, such as being closeted at work or not working in your intended field due to discrimination. And so there is a lot of factors within the queer and trans community that specifically speak to different determinants of health and the impacts that lack of resources have on our communities. And so this is an important piece as we think now about anti-trans legislation nationally and the ways in which that reality impacts the mental health and well-being of the folks that we serve. And I'd like you to think about the realities of navigating, for example, housing and food insecurity, and feeling underrepresented within curriculum since you started going to school, feeling nervous about entering a job market or keeping employment while you see the realities of anti-trans legislation happening across the country and the ripples of that. It can be really, really, really damaging for young people, especially to see that as they're trying to navigate hardships within their own life, usually economic hardships. And so, really wanting to talk about this through an intersectional perspective. The brilliant Kimberly Crenshaw talks about intersectionality as a lens where we can see power coming through, colliding, locking, and intersecting. And of course, the acknowledgement that everyone has their own unique experience of discrimination and privilege. So often, the very confusing seesaw that we are on, where we sometimes feel incredibly powerful and sometimes feel incredibly disempowered, and the reasons or realities as to why. And so I think when we think about intersectional perspective or experience, what I really want this to be is a lens that you look at, you know, ongoing anti-trans legislation and the ways in which that affects a variety of folks within the community who experience various margins of identity and marginalization of such. So, for example, thinking about racialized young people, thinking about unhoused young people, and of course, thinking about youth and children as an intersectionality piece of its own, as often young people are not empowered to make choices that are actually reflective of their needs or wants or desires. And so, a huge part of our work is making sure that young people have voice and are able to speak truth to power in relationship to things like legislation, but also things like representative curriculum within their school spaces where there hasn't yet been any kind of anti-trans legislation. So I'm going to talk about a bunch of information. And so it might be a little overwhelming. I'm very happy to share the slides and also the resources where I got the slides so you can learn more about what's happening across the country. And acknowledging that this is just the beginning, this is the tip of the iceberg of engaging in this work. And I'm really, really, really available to answer questions post conversation today and really want to make this information and learning as accessible and supportive to you as possible. This is an anti-trans legislative risk map that was created by a really amazing young person in Montreal named Celeste Trannon. This is up to date as of November 2024. There are a few pieces that we're going to look at. Some that I will be talking about are policy 713, Bill 137, and most recently, I'll be focusing most of my time talking about Bill 26, 27, and 29 that was recently passed in Alberta. And I'm going to be focusing on that because that is the most recent um, bill that has been brought forward and passed, unfortunately, just a few days ago. And so I will be speaking about what that means for Albertans and what that means for folks across the country. Maybe I'll actually just quickly go back so you can take a moment with this map. Um, you can see that there is a little legend on the side. Um, Things that are blue, like provinces that are blue, are a low risk. Red is worst active anti-trans laws. Orange is high risk, or lighter orange is a moderate risk. And then we have a grid pattern. And on each of those grid patterns, it means something else. One means legislation with a notwithstanding clause and legislation without said clause. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. So, from a very non-legal perspective, this is my understanding of the notwithstanding clause. And I wanted to break it down as in the most simple way as possible, because when I first was reading about this as a trans person and also as a youth worker, I wanted to make sure I understood as much as I could. Um, so this permits federal and provincial legislation to pass laws that violate sections 2, 7 through 15 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which encompass fundamental freedoms, legal rights, equality rights for renewable periods of 5 years. So when I was looking into this, I was really shocked to see what sections 7 through 15 cover, as well as section 2, which includes disrupting racial discrimination, ableism, ageism, and the ability to practice religious freedoms, etc. And so the use of this clause historically is politically difficult and therefore rare. It's used by provinces only a handful of times and has never been used by the federal government. So I have a little bit of history. I will share just a quick piece of history around Alberta. So Alberta invoked the notwithstanding clause in response to the federal government's passing of Bill C-23. Bill C-23 guaranteed same-sex couples the same benefits as heterosexual couples after a year of cohabitation. Um, Alberta responded by passing Bill 202, which threatened to invoke the notwithstanding clause should Canada ever redefine marriage to anything other than a man or a woman. Um, so this is some of the history of the notwithstanding clause. So you can see that it's not used ever for good. We also see an example of this in 2019 with the quite controversial act within Quebec, in which Quebec declared the intention to invoke the notwithstanding clause to support an act which prohibited civil service employees and public teachers from wearing religious symbols like kippas, crosses, and hijabs while working. They were successful in implementing this notwithstanding clause, which means that it again could be overturned in the future, but of course had a huge impact on religious liberties in Quebec. So this notwithstanding clause is being used or being threatened to be used around anti-trans legislation nationally. And this is deeply, deeply troubling because not only does this impact trans people, but also folks of any intersection of marginalized experience and identity that is protected by this charter. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some pieces that are coming into effect. There's a little legend on the side. And I'm not going to go through every single piece of legislation or possible legislation, but I just wanted to show the amount of um, anti-trans legislation within the context of so-called Canada. So these were introduced or in effect in 2024. And so they're broken down into provinces. And I'm going to talk a lot about Alberta's because these, again, are very recent. But we see anti-trans legislation in Alberta around education, health, and sport. Um, we see more in BC around sport. Thankfully, in BC, this was defeated at first reading. In Manitoba, we see pieces around um, name change amendment acts, which can potentially uh, be troublesome in the future, but we also see some positive pieces around granting trans folk policy. And then we, of course, see Bill 713, Policy Bill 173, which is not a bill. And hopefully, this policy in New Brunswick actually will be shifted, but it is still considered something that we need to be looking at until it has been edited and shifted. Um, but yeah, we're hoping that it will be repealed soon. Of course, the election went as well as it could in this context. And so we are hoping for that to be shifted. Um, so I wanted to, of course, we also have some pieces around the Parental Bill of Rights in Saskatchewan and proposed trans change room ban, specifically affecting young trans girls in schools. And so, of course, this is a list of different policies, bills, and laws that have been brought forward just within this year. Some are positive, but a lot are rooted in the context of anti-trans legislation. And of course, this kind of like very quick overview of these contexts doesn't necessarily take into account all of the other pieces that we discussed earlier, which are the landscape wherein 2S LGBTQIA plus young people and communities are existing with less access to, for example, stable employment, stable housing, etc. So this is written or broken down by Celeste Trianon. And so I'm going to go through some of the pieces that were recently passed within Alberta. So this includes Bill 26, Bill 27, and Bill 29. And of course, while this is in and through the context of Alberta, it's really important to take note as to um, how this happened and the political environment which allowed for this to happen. And also thinking about the response that is supportive right now to folks that are still reeling from this decision. Um, and so when thinking about allyship or solidarity in relationship to 2S LGBTQI plus young people, specifically two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming young people, it's important to think about the impacts that young people will feel even out of province from knowing that something like Bill 26 exists. And currently in our context, working to advocate and support and shift protections for two-spirit, trans, and gender nonconforming youth, children, and adults within our province. So, yeah, the Bill 26 is specifically related to restricting medically necessary healthcare for vulnerable youth by forbidding Alberta regulated healthcare professionals, including doctors and pharmacists, from prescribing puberty blockers and hormone therapy to persons under the age of 18. It also prohibits surgeries related to gender affirming care through these age ranges of youth. It's also important to talk about how the Alberta Medical Association, the Canadian Pediatric Association, and the American Psychological Association are all opposed to such gender affirming care bans. And there's a lot of reasons why there is opposition to care bans like this. One, because trans affirming care is life saving and is a life saving tool to support young people in not only self actualizing who they are, but allowing them to feel comfortable in their skin, to feel comfortable engaging with their peer group, and feel comfortable engaging in consistent spaces like school/education, and of course, um, offering brilliant contributions to the communities that they belong to. There is an Education Amendment Act concerning the rights of trans youth at school. This bill forbids Alberta school boards from learning and teaching resources that deal primarily and explicitly with gender identity, sexual orientation, or human sexuality without ministerial approval. And it also imposes a very dangerous requirement for parents to provide consent before their young person is engaging with anything to do with the 2S LGBTQI plus identity. This also forbids a student who is under the age of 16 from using a new name or pronouns without parental consent. Um, and so there's a lot of reasons why this is very troubling and deeply harmful. One, because if we were existing as a youth project within the context of Alberta, our roles within the school system, which are deeply practiced and important, would cease to exist. Um, we do a lot of work with the provincial Department of Education to ensure that 2S LGBTQI plus conversation curriculum is taught through the context and expertise of lived experience in classroom spaces. Our workshops are created to ensure that young people have access to not only representative curriculum, but representative adults who have experience within the context of living while and working while trans, and ensuring young people that they too can grow and age and experience the world in the way that they would like to with supports from their community. A really important piece is to note is that when we look at things like our student success survey that is published provincially within our province, we see high amounts of trans youth, of 2S LGBTQI plus youth who feel generally unsafe in their classrooms. And a huge part of that is due to the lack of support embedded in the school ecosystem and school culture. A lot of that can be shifted by having conversations rooted in education and care that not only normalize 2S LGBTQIA plus experiences, but celebrate it. And I truly believe that that work should be held by members of the community. And so we see the ways in which access to representative curriculum and access to representative spaces can deeply impact a young person's mental health in a positive context, as well as ensuring that conversations that are happening within a professional development context for school administrators and teachers are held and supported with the support of organizations such as ours. Um, and so, of course, something like an education amendment feels like a million steps backwards, just as I feel across the country we have seen more leaps in relation to representative curricula and curriculum outcomes. Another piece that I'll say here is that many of our young people don't want to be out within their home life for a numerous amount of reasons. One chief factor being a lack of supportive home space and family. And so it feels really important that young people have a chance to explore and experiment and learn about themselves and feel certain about elements of who they are before having to get consent from their families to practice that exploration, which is a deeply healthy part of young people's development. So I think overall, this bill will have the impact of ostracizing trans youth and preventing them from having senses of privacy and preventing them from safely exploring their identities. It will also inevitably increase levels of bullying and harassment that trans students face. I think something that I've learned from existing as a member of the Youth Project for many years is that when we travel across the province and we get asked questions within classroom spaces about different identities and experiences of identities, there is almost immediate shift in a classroom energy where young people realize that the questions they have are normal and should be encouraged and supported, versus feeling shame around questions they may have or shame around a lack of information that they have due to the context of their home life. And so it's deeply important that these conversations can happen. And this final piece that I'll share is about Fairness and Safety in Sport Act, which is a restriction on trans participation in sports. And this prevents trans and gender diverse girls, so very targeted towards trans feminine young people, including one in elementary, from participating in sports in school. And there's some more information on this slide about all of the ways that that shows up. But it is important to note that this is not instituting a ban on trans women in sport on its own. However, it's clearly designed to authorize the government to do so or create a possibility for that. Um, yeah, by creating precedent. And so again, these bills have deep impact, such as trans people's ability to fully participate in society, trans youth's ability to thrive regardless of where they were born to or who they were born to. Trans youth are skipping school and already um, engaging in realities of self-harm because of the impact of the bill's announcements. And so it's really important that there is a conversation around the necessity of more supportive spaces and pushback to this anti-trans legislation and the rise of anti-trans legislation across the country. As we think about all of these pieces, I want to introduce a framework that I love so much. This is called Shared Work Models as Community Practice. It was created by Tuesday Reinhardt, wonderful name. And this talks about how work is the container that brings us together. And while we may have a variety of and potentially differential politics or differential contexts of work or employment. It means that while we have different paths, we still come to the same context of a shared work model. And this idea of shared work model allows for all of our different pathways of employment or expertise to come to the same place, which hopefully should be the protection and support of two-spirit trans and gender nonconforming young people. And so while we have different opinions, feelings, kind of parameters to the scope of our work, we can all take different methods and different um, creative intervention to disrupting these patterns and these hateful patterns within the context of Canada and within our province. Some elements of the shared work model that I really love that I'll share with you is one, relationship as resolution, two, inquiry as answer, staying curious and staying interested in self-education and the education of our teams, all levels, all the time, thinking about again an intersectional framework and analyses to this shared work of supporting young trans and gender nonconforming young people, seeking multiplicity, inviting the whole person or the whole community that we are thinking about when we are planning contexts of solidarity or support, and power matters. So noticing and working within the powers that we have, and also naming the limitations of the reach or scope of our work. So thank you so much for your time. These are emails that you can use to get in touch if you have further questions. I can also make the slides available, but I will share that Celeste Trianon's website is a huge resource. That's where there's a lot of work happening nationally to gather information about bills that are proposed and bills that have passed. And it also is a way to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of solidarity actions within your province or other provinces, but also just to stay up to date and informed about the anti-trans legislation that we see. And there's a lot of amazing resources on that website as well that link you to further reading about supporting young trans people. But if you are interested in looking at the impacts of um, transphobia and homophobia within the classroom, there is, of course, our provincial student success survey that has a lot of really pertinent information that discusses all of these pieces that I shared. And I think it really illustrates the deep need for protective policy locally and provincially to ensure that anti-trans legislation doesn't affect the young people in our province. So thank you so much for your time and for your energy. I'll let Chris take over.
Well, after that, my name is Chris Cochrane. So I am the support service educator here at this youth project. So mine's not going to be as slide heavy as Carmel's was. I wanted to talk to you more of our personal experiences and also about some of the practices that are going on in Canada that we are dealing with as trans individuals. One of the things that is very clear is I like to call this thing called polite ignorance that we have here in Canada and in Nova Scotia, where we like to pretend that we have homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, racism, or anything like that. And if we don't have it, if we do have it, it is not as bad as other countries as per United States. But as a trans Black individual, I can tell you that we do have misogyny, we definitely have racism, and we definitely do have trans misogyny as well. So the problem with accessing care as a trans individual is that we feel like we have to go through so many doors before we're even taken care of as an individual. So me as a racialized person, first, a lot of things that come up for us are, well, maybe the medical thing that is happening with you is because of your race or because of your background. And then after that, it's, well, are you a plus size person? And then after that, it's, well, are you mentally unstable or you have mental things? And then it goes into being a trans person. So it's like we have to step through 18 different doors before we can even get to the process of having the our medical issues being met. And one of the things that we have that I feel sometimes is a cop out is from a lot of medical professionals that will say they do not want to take on clients as a trans individual because they do not want to offend someone or they feel that they cannot offer the care. I was recently working with sexual reproduction health rights here in Nova Scotia, and I was meeting with people that were from different countries, Mexico, Indonesia, and two other countries. And we were saying that our care that is here in Nova Scotia was on par with places that were considered third world countries, or as we're considered a first world country. We were still having the same processes and still having the same doors being shut on our faces before we could get to the access of care. And unfortunately, that we're seeing, especially with our youth these days, is the indoctrination, talk, or the talk about that, trans people are, youth are too young to be starting their transition, or that there is trans people that are getting surgeries done at the ages of 12 and 13 and 14. That is not the case at all. We cannot have there is a process that is known as your hormone blockers, which is basically they put you on a blocker and it helps to slow down either testosterone or your estrogen. And then if the person for some reason does not decide to go through with transition or with medical transition, I should say, the system after they go off of it just flushes out of their system. Hormones such as testosterone and estrogen are not introduced into their system until much older, like 16, 17 years old, because you're still going through different things in your process so that your body will not accept it. So there's no cases. Also, all of surgeries and all gender affirming care was also first created for cisgender people that were going through surgery. So people that were, born intersex. So people were born with, ambiguous sexual genitalia or different things like that. That was used for them as well. Only 15% of gender affirming care is actually done through trans people. And we are considered 1% of the population. So focusing on just 1% of the population seems more like bullying, less than actual affirmative care. And this is what we are pushing up against. So we, unfortunately, at this time are having a lot of youth and a lot of people that are fearful that if they don't get their letters or if they don't get their medical processes done before next year, because of the political climate that we are having, that they might not have access to this care. So there's a very big front to it, and it can lead to isolation. It can lead to mental health problems, ideation. It can lead to so many other processes, and we are seeing it far beyond the reach of what we would normally see on a day-to-day basis, especially with our political climate and with the misinformation that is out there. One of the big things that we have, especially for me, when I started my transition was roughly around 15 to almost 20 years ago. So, social media wasn't where it was back then. But now, because of social media, we have a lot of information, but we also have a lot of disinformation out there. The average expectancy rate of a trans Black woman in North America is 35 years old. I am turning 40 next year, so I am already 5 years past my expectancy rate of being a trans woman in North America. And the reason why the expectancy rate is so low is because we've either taken our lives beforehand or we have our lives taken from us beforehand. And when it comes to mental issues, there's still a lot of people that believe that we have that is inherently a bad thing to be a trans person, or it is something that needs to be fixed or changed. Especially in the medical field, they use the term, sorry, my mind just went blank for a second. We have euphoria and then we have dysphoria. But in the medical profession, they use a lot of dysphoric side of things. So basically, what can we do to make this person not like themselves or like themselves? Or what can we do? Or we focus on just the negative side of things, and that's the dysphoric side of things. And with that process, unfortunately, what is happening is that we're focusing so much on the negative that we're not getting to the process of making sure that the trans person is getting to where they need to by using the euphoric side of things, which is basically the happy, the joy, the bliss that is coming along to make sure that the person is feeling whole inside and out. Another thing that we have problems with is that people believe that all trans people should have surgery. Nobody in any of the world just owes you a surgery, especially when it comes to our non-binary folk. A lot of people believe that they should be ambiguous or they should not, be masculine or feminine. And that's, again, a lack of education. When I started my transition many years ago, they were saying that for me to be able to access my medical care, I had to look a certain way or look feminine to be able to see that I am actually going to do so. But that is no longer a process that we use. There's some places that still do, but with a process that is kind of outdated because there's no way to look feminine or look masculine. And with those barriers, we have that access to care. Now, there is a such thing as WPATH and CPATH doctors who actually train to deal with transgender people. And it's a course that you can take electively. The problem with that, and what I'm helping and I have been helping here in Nova Scotia, is making sure that curriculum is actually in medical professionals when they're in university and the college level, because we want to make sure that when they're leaving school, they are equipped to work with any individual that they're going to come in contact. So therefore, that whole process of, oh, I don't want to offend, or I don't want to take on somebody because I don't think I'll have the access or the education behind me to be able to do that, is then null and void, because they're actually taking the initiative to have that in. Now, to become a WPATH doctor or a CPATH doctor, you have to take a course, but it's an elective course outside of your own thing. My doctor took it beforehand. Another thing that a lot of people don't realize is there's only one doctor in that, which is Montreal, that does the bulk of the transition, so the gender affirming surgeries, and to be put on that waiting list and to have to wait and do those things, it takes a long time. And the process of even getting to that point is so much. We have to first be evaluated by ourselves, and then be evaluated for the government to be able to process that. And unfortunately, what is happening is sometimes there's duplicates and sometimes triplicate of doctors and of letters and of things that we have to go through to be able to get to that point to be able to do it. I started my paperwork in 2015, and it wasn't until close to the end of 2016, almost 2017, until I had all my paperwork so it could be submitted to the government, so it could be accepted. And even still, some people might wait months and things like that. And sometimes it feels almost like the process is so broad ranged and so difficult that so people would kind of almost like give up by the time they get to that. And the thing is you have to go through medical processes of that, and then also the mental, annuity that it takes on your body as well. So the thing that I am focusing on more is, especially trans health care, is making sure that access care is just is bare minimum. And that's the problem, is that we're not even getting the bare minimum. Before we could, be thought of like, oh, I have diabetes, or I have, I need to have things done with my gastric, or I have a brain tissue, disorder or something like that. We don't get to that point because it's first being blamed on the estrogen or the testosterone that we're taking, or it's blamed on the medical things that are helping us with our transition. And we are not looked as a patient, we're looked as a trans patient. And those need to be alleviated so that people can actually get to the point of where they are getting the things that are really the problem and being focused on. A big thing as also is trans misogyny that we have within, that medical healthcare, and believing that all trans women are, a certain way. Now, I'm a trans person, trans woman, but I don't speak and I don't have the characteristics of all trans women. That is not a thing. Also, I have had my surgery in 2018, so my gender affirming surgery. And once I was done of that, I was asked by medical professionals, now you're done of your transition, what are you going to do next? And I'm like, what does that even mean? It's not like, we're playing Mario Kart and I'm getting to my final boss and then I become the trans person that I am. So transitioning is not just about medical processes. And with that, that whole narrative of them making sure that somebody looks a certain way to be trans is not only harmful to the trans people, but it's harmful to a lot of other people. One of the things that we're seeing is a lot of harm to Black women in process, because a lot of people feel that Black women have a more masculine look, and they are being targeted more on a daily basis for being trans, even if they are a cisgendered person. We are having youth that are, looking ambiguous, and therefore they are also, even though they are cis, they are also being focused on for being a trans person. Now, being a trans person in Canada, we do have access to certain care and certain medical procedures, but we are also told, it could still be worse if you were in this place or in this country. It will be, worse for you, and you should be lucky that you're and happy that you're just alive. One of the things that is problematic, especially in Canada, because of that polite ignorance, as I was talking, is that things are not documented, things are not informed about. We do not have the statistics that we need to make sure they're informed. One of the first times that we were seeing, especially here in Nova Scotia, was the census that was done last year, which makes Nova Scotia actually has the highest rate of trans people in Canada. But that was all that we saw, was that there was just a high concentration of trans people. There was no reasoning why, what can we do to help, what are the medical procedures that are done. There is none of those things that are being documented. And because we're not documenting them, there's not enough information out there, not just for folks that are not in the trans community, but for people that are in the trans community and still trying to focus and find out where they lie in all of those things. So one of the biggest problems that we have is the information and all of the disinformation. So you working, with human rights, one of the things that we have to make sure is that everybody is adequately focused on. One of the things that we used to focus on was equality. Equality was one of those things of making sure that everybody, has broad strokes, or everybody's recorded to the same. But unfortunately, that doesn't work. Equity is what we actually necessarily need, making sure that people who need the care and people that need the actual access to the care are getting that as well. There is a lot of people, especially in our rural areas. One of the things that we at the Youth Project, we've kind of had a hybrid for a few years now of working with youth in residential areas, either online or in person. And what I do as a support worker, I actually work one-on-one with youth, talking about their issues that they have, or just being able to explain to someone how they feel being trans with another trans person. But we're seeing it so much more in residential areas, and we're also seeing it so much more in youth, which I mean right down to the primary levels. And a lot of people want to ask, why is it that, or is it too young for people to be learning about gender, from day one in primary school? They learn about mom and dad, so why can't they learn that there is other people that are in it as well? I feel that education just needs to be done, and a lot of people are fearful of giving the education because themselves have not had the education. So what we need to do is making sure that our doctors are being held accountable for the the lack of, and also our governmental processes that are being shifted our way, as we've seen in New Brunswick and in Alberta, and even in Ontario. There's some processes that are coming towards us that are making it more difficult for people to access care, and it's based on information and miseducation. So, with that saying, I think it kind of ties back into what Carmel was saying, is that we need to make sure that we are, doing our own research, but we're also educating ourselves within the community and outside of the community. So with that, Carmel, do you want to come back on and show your beautiful face with me?
Thank you so much, Chris. That was wonderful. We have a little bit of time for questions. And also, if folks want either Chris or myself to go over anything that we discussed in further detail, happy to. I know I talked a lot about a bunch of yeah, policy pieces and legislation pieces quickly. So that is totally okay. Yeah, if that is an ask. We have one question in the Q&A, which says, what are examples of anti-trans violence and incidents in Nova Scotia schools? So I really appreciate that question. I think it looks like a lot of different things. In some situations, I think it looks very much like how you would imagine it to look, like physical violence. And then in other ways, it is more subtle. So maybe there is a young person in a classroom who is outed against their consent, or elements of their identity are shared amongst their classmates without their consent, which can be very difficult for that young person to navigate. Other examples would be just young people feeling nervous walking down the halls because people in their classroom or in their school are yelling things at them, or pointing at them or laughing at them about different elements of their identity or gender expression. Um, and there have been many different examples that I can pull from. But I think it is also important to look at the subtle ways that transphobia and violence shows up in our schools. And so an example would be a young person in a school provincially shared that, and they're 12 years old, shared that they were learning about diverse families in their class, and someone in their class interrupted the lesson and pointed at this student and said, "You're the reason why we have to learn about this." And in that moment, of course, like one, that's not true. It's provincially mandated, um, yeah, curricula, but also it singles out that young person, and it emboldens other students to engage with that young person in aggressive and or violent and or discriminatory ways. So that would be like, I think, a more subtle, even though it's not that subtle, but a more subtle expression of violence. And then, of course, we have like young people that don't go to the bathroom while they're at school because they're afraid of physical violence or sexualized violence at school, based on their gender and gender identity. Um, yeah, great question.
I would like to also put to one of the things that we're having a problem with is active, transphobia and homophobia, and passive. So, passive is like, where it sounds like a compliment, or it doesn't sound so much like it is a negative thing, but the person is still inherently feeling it. And it's not so out and abrupt. And teenagers are very crafty at making sure, to word their words and things like that. So one of the things is that, and also fear of being not just outed, but fear of being ostracized from their community as well. So what we're seeing sometimes is that people that are trans or are, in the queer community are kind of leading the charge sometimes against other queer people because they're fearful of doing it as well. So it comes with that dynamic as well.
Thank you, Chris. There's some great other questions in the chat. The first question is about the map and why Nova Scotia was orange. That's a great question. So I can share that slide if I can. Yes, okay. I think that I'm going to be able to do that. And so you'll see that Nova Scotia is at a moderate risk. So it's not at a high risk or the worst risk, but it's at a moderate risk due to, at this point, our upcoming election. And so the person that made this map had yeah, was sharing that they were worried about an upcoming election and what that meant for the future of Two-Spirit trans and gender nonconforming youth in relationship to healthcare access and support. It is important to note that we see a lot of anti-trans legislation targeting our schools, and across the country. And in Nova Scotia, there isn't actually a policy to protect trans students. There are guidelines that are being put through by the Department of Education that are a wonderful place to start, that talk about supporting trans students and engaging with interrupting transphobia within the context of our schools. But there isn't yet any kind of protective policy for young trans youth within our school system or school network. So that would be probably one of the reasons why we're seen as a moderate risk to this map maker, as well as, of course, the our recent election. We see the ways in which the Conservative Party across the country have been pushing for legislative change in relationship to anti-trans legislation. And so, of course, I think the map maker was worried about the upcoming election at the time of November and unsure of what it would look like moving forward. Great question. Yeah, there's two great questions in the chat. One is about being connected to the youth project. So Chris or I are great launch points to that young person. Chris, as Chris was sharing, is an um, amazing resource at the Youth Project. And she does sessions like myself to talk to young people one-on-one digitally about how they're feeling, how they're doing. And it's a peer support service that we offer. And that's often a way that young people that are a little bit nervous to access something like a program for school-age kids might want to access first as a kind of soft landing to the organization. And so they can email me or Chris, and our emails are just our name at youthproject.ns.ca, and I'll put mine in the chat. And yeah, you can reach out at any point. Um, Another person says, can you explain what gender affirming care looks like at different ages? You often hear kids are just accessing this medical care at school or whatever, but what is the actual process like? That is an amazing question. And maybe I'll start, and then Chris, if you want to jump in, that would be awesome. But it's a pretty lengthy process to access gender affirming care. So currently in the province, if you are under the age of 19, the route that you usually would go through is um, getting, either you have a supportive family doctor or you don't have a supportive family doctor and you need to access support through something like the IWK Trans Health Team. And so either through your doctor or through a very wonderful health team through the IWK, you would go through a process of conversation with doctor, conversations around mental health and well-being, support systems, support networks, what your hopes are, who your support networks are. Do you have a supportive family structure? Do you not? As well as a lot of medical intervention, things like blood work, general checkup, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and many of these processes do need some kind of parental or guardian-based consent for young people to engage with. Um, and that is how the current process looks. If you are over the age of 19, you wouldn't qualify to be part of the IWK Trans Health Team anymore. And so you'd have to access either support through your family doctor or support through um, a various health and sexuality center, such as the Halifax Sexual Health Center. Um, but medical care is definitely something that is a decision that a young person makes in support with their support network, whether that's their guardians or their parents, um, and is something that takes quite a long time to access. And so it isn't just something that can be accessed at school. It's quite an intensive process. Chris, do you want to add anything to that piece?
Yeah, the thing is a lot of people focus so much on the physical side of gender affirming care. Let's be honest, everybody in the whole world has gender affirming care. It's just that when it comes to the focus of trans people, it's just harder for them to access the care because it's not what what the society of normativity is giving out there. So sometimes it can look at with clothing, or sometimes it could just your support team or your sports team or things that make you feel more affirming in your own care. And being a trans individual, we sometimes feel ostracized or outed from the outside of the community. So sometimes just finding those narratives and finding those organizations that are helping us to kind of be ourselves is one of the things. But the problem is there's so much focus on the medical side of things and the surgical side of things that all of the other care is kind of left to the wayside. And I think, especially when it comes to youth, medical care and is one of the big things, but there is so much more, especially when it comes to mental health for youth, that needs to be encompassed, especially when it comes to gender affirming care.
Chris, that's such a great answer. I love that. And I think that brings a really incredible point, which is important to remember that gender affirming care can be something as simple as having a therapist that respects and understands who you are and isn't going to share with you that the reason why you're feeling sad or anxious is because of your gender identity, but rather that there are other things in your life that might be contributing to that mental health reality, and not pathologizing your experience. I think another piece that is important to share is that gender affirming care does look different at many ages. So for example, if there is a young person who's exploring their gender identity at age 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, they are a young person who's, like Chris said, probably exploring with things like changing a name or trying on new clothes, or trying a new haircut, right? There are so many ways that gender affirming care looks. And some people who are accessing gender affirming care will never access a surgical and or hormonal intervention. And that is totally their choice. Um, we're at time, but there's such great questions in the chat. Um, I think yeah, for whoever asked the question around detransitioning, I'll say very quickly that the way that I talk about that is often that every single person in our lives has information at that point in their life about who they are, and the identities that they hold. And as we age and as we learn more about ourselves, we are going to shift elements of how we present and how we identify. And that is a beautiful part um, of our gender expression. Detransitioning doesn't necessarily even mean um, like not being trans or gender nonconforming anymore. It might just mean shifting a specific intervention around access to hormones, for example. And often people who are choosing to stop something like a hormone replacement therapy, for example, are not people who usually regret being trans, but rather have decided that that intervention isn't right for their body, and they're trying something new now. And so I think about the context of detransitioning as like a way that we learn more about who we are, and it then gives us the tools to make more informed choices about what we want, but doesn't mean that other people don't need access to like that life-saving healthcare. Yeah, great questions. Um, so to wrap up, to answer some folks' questions, yes, there are resources available for parents. If you are a parent or if you have parents in your life that are looking for resources, you can send an email to me. We also have a lot of resources on our website. And a question about Nova Scotia being rural. We do a lot of traveling, and we also have an office in Sydney, as well as a new staff member who's located in Kentville. So we try to maintain 3 locations across the province and then travel throughout those 3 locations. So thank you all for your questions and engagement. It was wonderful. Yeah, wonderful meeting and engaging with all of you.
Thank you, Carmel, and thank you, Chris. And the level of engagement just speaks to what an important topic this is. So thank you so much, and I hope that folks will find the Youth Project online and seek out additional resources as they need to. Should you wish to reach out to the Commission so that we could make connections, please feel free to do so. It's been over a decade since gender identity and gender expression were added as protected characteristics under the Nova Scotia Human Rights Act. And unfortunately, it's necessary that we continue to have to provide such education sessions and to continue to need to fight to simply hold the line when it comes to the respect for one another's inherent dignity. So thank you to the Youth Project for the work that you do and for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here today to share this important information. The session has been recorded, and a recording will be available on the Commission's website within 24 hours. So for folks that know of others that weren't able to make it, who may have been interested, you're able to find that recording online and to share it broadly, please. I would also just lastly like to plug that the partnership with the Atlantic International Film Festival is winding to a close. There's just over 24 hours remaining for anyone that would be interested in watching the documentary film Sugarcane for free online. That powerful documentary tells the story of survivors and families impacted by Canada's Indian Residential Schools program. It is an incredible documentary. If you haven't had an opportunity to view it, you can still do so. So you can get your get your ticket via the commission's website at humanrights.novascotia.ca. Thank you, Chris and Carmel, once again, very much. And thank you to Monica for providing ASL today. Take care, folks.
Thank you.